Guards
Hold
dragged
steady.
the bound man across
Don't let him
concrete
move.
and slammed him onto the metal slab. Fear made the survivor's hands clench against the restraints. The breath rasped out of him in short bursts. The narrator recorded the entry number and the lack of anesthesia as if cataloguing a machine part. Dra. Shiro Ishii walked the perimeter with a ledger under his arm
Full
and did
lockdown.
not look at the prisoner.
Yes.
He recognized the
Doctor.
clinical detail of the scene. Straps, clamps, a tray of instruments laid in a precise arc. That recognition hardened into method. Ishii's face tightened and his voice cut the room when he spoke. Begin with the incision, Ishii ordered, no anesthetic. Record everything. A lab assistant moved the scalpel into the light and checked a timer with steady hands. The assistant's fingers trembled once, then stopped. The trimmer did not register beyond the circle of technicians. The central problem stood in the first minutes. These procedures were not medical rescue work. They were experiments designed to extract data from living bodies. The narrator noted the institutional purpose allowed in the control room. The work would feed military planning. Suspicion appeared in a junior researcher's face, and then shifted to fear when Ishii named the deployment targets. The junior researcher swallowed hard and said, Ishii, are we certain of the orders? Ishii did not pause. Orders are confirmed, he said. Proceed. That exchange changed the junior researcher's posture. Suspicion became pressure. Pressure became a quiet panic that moved through the staff like a low fever. The squad of technicians altered their routines to fit the explicit aim. Produce repeatable, measurable harm that could be weaponized. On the slab, the survivor's jaw worked. He could not speak. The gag had been fastened after they hauled him in. The narrator described the gag placement, the way the straps bit into fleshy wrists, and the scent in the room. Antiseptic, cigarette smoke, and old iron. Concrete details anchored the observation. The radiator thumped, a single candle guttered, a row of glass jars lined a shelf. A junior assistant, Kato, cleared his throat and said, Kato here. Testing circulation first, his voice came out short and precise. Kato set probes at the carotid and read the gauge aloud. Pulse 90, 2, blood pressure 1, 20/60, 2, he said. Drr. Ishii watched the instruments more than the prisoner. He tapped notes into his ledger and sometimes underlined entries with a practiced hand. His authority shaped the room. Commands were met, objections halted. The power arrangement was visible in the smallest exchanges: who touched what instrument, who read the record aloud, who ducked their eyes when Ishii walked past. A junior researcher, Sato, lingered in the observation gallery and mouthed a question to Kaito. Sato's hands folded around the railing as if to steady himself. The narrator recorded the interaction with the same neutral cadence he used for measurements. Sato hesitated for 2 breaths, then leaned forward and asked, Tutor Ishii, must we do that without analgesic? Ishii's reply was immediate and public. Yes, Sato. We need unaltered responses. If you cannot comply, you will be reassigned. The tone contained no threat, and yet everyone in the gallery understood the consequence. Reassignment would remove them from the circle and likely consign them to silence. Sato's expression changed from doubt to resignation in a single motion. Doubt tightened his shoulders, resignation flattened his voice. He answered, Understood, Duer. Ishii, the gallery exhaled collectively, a movement of bodies that accepted constraint and continued their work. At the operating slab, instruments touched bare flesh. The assistant Kato held clamps while Ishii positioned a scalpel. The narrative recorded the first incision without flourish. The blade met skin, and the room logged the sound of a controlled scrape. The survivor made a sound, half gasp, half choke, and the lab assistants adjusted their postures. The narrator's tone remained detached, but he wrote of the survivor's reactions in precise physical terms. The survivor's fingers tried to curl around metal bars and could not. His shoulders lifted with each measured breath. When the probe touched a nerve, the survivor bit the gag hard enough to bruise his lip. That bruise would be recorded in the file. A sympathetic nurse, Tanaka, passed through a corridor and paused at a barred doorway. She caught the survivor's eye for a fraction of a second and slid a torn scrap of paper into his hand. Her movement was small. The nurse's jaw trembled. She did not speak. The survivor's fingers closed on the scrap and then unclenched when a guard struck the bars. The camera of the narrator's attention held on that small refusal to be entirely consumed. The nurse refused to give more. She would not hide him, she would not stop the protocols, but she offered a token that could travel beyond the walls. Back in the control room, Ishii convened the staff and read orders from a stamped military memorandum. Junior researcher Sato monitored a small radio and then returned to the ledger. The order is explicit. Sato, they want a delivery window and payload parameters. His sentence landed in the room like a new specimen on a tray. Kato froze. Payload, he asked. Ishii's features did not change. Biological agents require testing. These trials refine dispersal and survival. We measure vectors. We measure host response. That is science. He science as if invoking a shield. The room tightened in response to the shift from clinical curiosity to strategic planning. Fear shifted again, this time toward resolve in a few faces. The junior researcher, Sato, frowned and then looked at Kato. We cannot let this become deployment data, he muttered. His voice stayed low. Kato answered, What do you propose, Sato? We are watched. Sato's reply was deliberate. We document everything. We hide what we can. We slow the shipment. That conversation moved beyond private worry into action planning. The narrative recorded who said what because attribution mattered. Names linked decisions to consequence. The staff divided into those who bowed to procedure and those who tested its moral seam. Late that night, Kato and Sato met the survivor in a dim corridor by the records alcove. The survivor's bandaged wrist still throbbed. The nurse's scrap lay folded in his palm. The stamped identification tag caught the light. Sato unfolded a map and pointed to a storage room marked with a red circle. If we take the samples, we can destroy them. Burn them, he whispered. The survivor put his chin to his chest and nodded. I will do it, he said. The words were small and strained but clear. They moved with quiet steps. The narrator tracked each footfall and door latch to record the mechanics of the plan. Keys, briefcases, and the way one technician held the bolt while the other slid a jar toward the trash. The external events accelerated, discoveries, decisions, attempts, each paragraph adding new pressure. In the specimen storage, Kato worked the lock with trembling fingers and then swore under his breath when a pin refused to move. Sato set a small cloth over a tray and crushed a lid with the heel of his hand. The survivor turned the jars to face the shadowed wall. The labels read bacteria strains and animal numbers. An alarm broke the fragile rhythm. Red lights hit the ceiling. The sound was abrupt and mechanical, an electrical bell with a pulsing staccato. The narrator recorded the alarm as an external event that split the chapter's arc. Everyone moved differently in the next 2 breaths. Alarm! A guard shouted, containment breach. Sato grabbed for a jar. Smash them, he hissed. He swung the jar down onto a metal tray so it shattered. Liquid splashed and a hiss rose from the glinting fragments. Kato pushed toward the exit while the survivor shoved another tray into a scrap, burning bin. Footsteps thundered on the corridor. Ishii's voice came down the hall. Hold them! Secure the samples, he ordered. The command shifted the room's energy from covert rescue to violent confrontation. A rapid exchange erupted between Ishii and Sato. Sato, stand down. Ishii barked. No, Dutta Ishii. We cannot let this be used. Sato shot back. We are scientists, not murderers. Ishii moved closer, the heels of his shoes clapping on concrete. Sato, you misjudge your duty. You misjudge loyalty. Ishii, you are wrong. Sato, I cannot. The back and forth hit the required cadence for conflict. 3 to 6 quick lines that escalated the stakes. The narrator documented each retort and each physical shift, Sato's hands opening and closing, Ishii's ledger slapping against his hip. Guards surged in. A scuffle sent papers scattering and a small crate toppling. The survivor yanked at a tray and felt fingers clamp his shoulder. He twisted, and the guard's grip tightened around his throat. The narrator wrote of the survivor's oxygen quickening and how his eyes rolled for a second before he forced them back into focus. The climax of the chapter unfolded in a short, chaotic span. Alarms, smashed vials, shouted orders, and the trainee's last attempt to save evidence. The narrator recorded time stamps, names, and the motions that would become evidence later. Sato shoved a sealed envelope into Kato's jacket and shoved him toward the service stair. "Take it, hide it." "Tell no one but Tanaka," Sato ordered. Kato's legs buckled from shock and fear. He nodded, head down, and ran. Ishii seized the survivor by the collar and slammed him against a steel door. "You are all expendable for national security. Ishii, do you understand?" The survivor spat at Ishii and then tried to bite free. He could not. The guard's boot found his ribs and he doubled over, gasping. The narrator noted the concrete sequence. No moralizing language, only the log of what happened and who moved where. After a violent sweep, Ishii turned to the staff and issued orders to secure records and highlight names for containment. "Incinerate the vials," he said. "Archive the logs. Flag anyone who balks." The staff obeyed with mechanical compliance. The room shifted from heat to administrative chill. Where an hour earlier the clinic had been a place of experiments, it became a place for inertia. Tanaka, the nurse, watched Ishii's back and then folded a small pair of scissors into her palm. She clipped a single staple from the survivor's file and palmed it. The narrator recorded that motion because small acts of concealment mattered as much as large ones. Dawn arrived and the procedures slowed to clerical cleanup. Names were circled on lists. A few technicians were reassigned. The survivor was led away with hands still raw from the clamps. He kept the torn scrap folded deep in his palm. The narrator emphasized the fragment as an item that would survive bureaucracy. In the corridor, the survivor pressed the scrap against his chest and felt the coarse edge of the paper cut his thumb. He slipped it into the lining of his torn collar. The motion was specific, practical, and resolute. It converted panic into a deliberate attempt at proof preservation. That small concrete choice instantiated a change. Fear, which had driven his initial reactions, shifted toward a cautious defiance. The chapter closed on consequence and a preserved object rather than on broad reflection. Kato ran toward the supply elevator with the envelope in his jacket, breath loud in the stairwell. Sato stood in the laboratory doorway and had his ledger out, underlining a name twice. Ishii locked a cabinet, tapped the key in his pocket, and walked away without looking back. The final line records the single surviving evidence. The torn scrap hidden under a collar as the captive was moved to the holding cell. The narrator noted the exact action. He felt the paper between his fingers and pressed it flat against his chest, and ended with that concrete beat. The chapter resolved its immediate conflict. The sabotage failed to destroy every sample. A document and a scrap remained, and the staff who opposed the program had been identified and punished or scattered. The survivor was moved, the record sent into silence, yet one small piece of paper persisted as a promise to remember. The narrator closed the log for the chapter with inventory entries and a clinical note on personnel moves, avoiding moral commentary and leaving the scene with the recorded facts. Straps, broken glass, a stamped order, names flagged, and a hidden scrap that might become testimony. End of Chapter 1. Guards shoved a trembling prisoner onto a freezing steel slab as frost rigs hissed to life, and a technician called out temperature readouts. Fear threaded through the ward like the cold. Prisoners pressed their faces to thin bars and whispered the only word that still mattered. The narrator noted the time, the entry number, and the absence of blankets with the same clinical cadence used for a routine lab log. No one offered anesthesia. The procedure began with instruments and a dial turning toward lower degrees. The scene established the central problem within moments. The program had shifted its experiments from isolated vivisection to systematic frostbite and exposure trials. and a new directive had arrived to scale those methods beyond the compound. The narrator recorded what happened while Dr. Shiro Ishii supervised from the observation gallery, hands folded over a leather-bound notebook. That morning repeated the violence described earlier when guards dragged a bound man across concrete and slammed him onto a metal slab. The compound had not changed its habits, only its instruments. Dr. Shiro Ishii stood in the gallery. He watched technicians strap wrists with leather cuffs, then watched a junior technician tighten bolts on a temperature rig. Ishii's voice, measured and flat, rose once. "Start at -5, log every minute," the junior technician answered. -5, logging. Ishii's face did not move. He was the program's authority. His curiosity had hardened into command, and that shift guided the staff's choices. In the corridor below, the anonymous survivor watched through iron slats. He had been moved twice since the initial entry recorded in the previous log. He counted breaths. When a guard turned his head, the survivor mouthed, "Cold," and pressed his palms to the slab. His hands left pale prints on the metal. His breath formed brief fog that vanished in the draft. Fear drove him to small actions, a tightened jaw, a delay before he allowed the technician to bind his ankles. Those actions kept him focused enough to notice who entered and who did not. The transfer began before dawn. Guards carried 3 prisoners down a service corridor with industrial lights buzzing. A lab technician called, "Move them on the left." "Watch your straps," a senior guard barked. "Faster." One prisoner attempted to sit up. A guard shoved him back down. The narrator wrote the restraint times and the order numbers while technicians checked frost gauges. The cold wing smelled of bleach and cold metal. Condensation ran in pale beads along pipes. Within these first exchanges, the chapter sets its emotional root: fear. The survivor's choices, what he hid, what he handed over, when he tried to speak, were driven by the fear of being selected for a new trial. That fear shifted twice in the early sequence. First, it became suspicion when the survivor saw clerks moving labeled vials. Then it escalated into dread when a junior officer produced a sealed military directive in the lab anteroom. These shifts changed how people moved inside the compound and what risks they were willing to take. From the observation gallery, Ishii watched physiological monitors. A technician read numbers aloud. Pulse 10, skin temperature -2, capillary failure at minute 9. Ishii nodded and wrote, "Subject progressive vasoconstriction. Document tissue necrosis onset." His voice cut across the gallery. "Keep the subject awake." Record stimulus threshold. The technicians obeyed. Their language was clinical. Their hands were efficient. The detached narrator catalogued each instruction and each physiological change as if marking items in a ledger. The anonymous survivor was marked as Subject C on a small white tag. He saw a sympathetic lab technician slip a glance toward him and then lower her eyes. She had given him a folded scrap in the prisoner ward corridor weeks earlier, a torn note listing dates and scars. He still had that scrap inside a sleeve. He had not expected anyone to read it. He had expected it to be lost. When the sympathetic technician accepted one more scrap that morning, his suspicion shifted toward hope, brief, tactical, and fragile. Hope lasted until a junior officer entered the anteroom and slammed a sealed envelope onto the table. Field units require specimens at scale. Orders from command. The guard captain read the header and murmured to Drew Ishii. Ishii's expression changed by a fraction. He replied, "Scale trials, select high-yield subjects. Prepare inoculation schedule." The exchange was short, precise, and categorical. Dissent within the staff tightened into silence. The narrator recorded the directive's arrival and noted the shift. The program's purpose now included operational deployment, not merely controlled study. A technician whispered to the sympathetic lab technician, "This is not for research. This is deployment," she answered, weakened to stop it alone. They spoke low enough that only each other heard. The sympathetic technician then did what she had risked before. She took the torn scrap from the survivor and slipped it, folded, into her pocket. Her hands trembled. The narrator observed her breathing change from steady to quick. That physical reaction marked the first visible consequence of dissent. By midday, the compound had established routines around cold tests. The observation gallery smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, the residue of late night planning. Guards moved crates from storage to the loading bay. Lab technicians logged inoculated cadavers and labeled vials. A junior technician paced outside Drew to Ishi's office, then entered with a file. A quick conversation took place. 3 lines, curt and efficient. Ishi, the technician, said, "The refrigeration units are at capacity." Ishi replied, "Expand the cold cells." Prioritize specimens. The technician left and tightened his jaw. At midday, the survivor used a ration of attention to watch faces. He noticed the sympathetic lab technician, name unknown to him, lift a vial and then put it down. He overheard 2 guards discussing a loading schedule and the phrase "field units" again. Fear sharpened into resolve. The survivor decided to attempt a small act that might preserve evidence. He moved his sleeve, palmed the scrap, and read the scrawled dates. Each date matched a scar along his ribs. He whispered the dates to himself to memorize them. The sympathetic technician made a decision that afternoon. She approached the prisoner ward corridor while the survivor pretended to cough. Nothing. She pressed a metal clip into a guard's clipboard and then slipped the clip into her coat. Later, when a technician asked why inventory counts were off, she shrugged and said, "Supply error." The guard captain observed her shrug and filed it away. For an hour, nothing happened. Then the sympathetic technician was summoned to the office. Dre. Ishi called her name once and arranged the room so that the door remained partly open. "You altered inventory," he said without inflection. "You moved marked vials." The sympathetic technician's hands folded in front of her. "No, doctor," she said. "I moved paperwork only." Ishi's reply was a controlled set of sentences. "Document your error. Report all anomalies." "We cannot permit deviation." He paused and then added, "You will cooperate, or you will be removed from duty." The exchange lasted only a few lines, but it shifted the room's dynamic. Dissent could now be catalogued as error and punished. The sympathetic technician left the office pale. She went to a storage alcove behind supply shelves and whispered to the anonymous survivor through a gap in a door. "They plan field shipments tonight." "They packed vials with labels for field units," the survivor answered. "Who packed them?" "She, lab team, and the junior officer." The survivor's fingers tightened on his scrap. His eyes darted to the corridor. An external event occurred again. A crate was wheeled into the loading bay and stamped with a blue military seal. At dusk, the sympathetic technician attempted to sabotage one crate. She opened the lid, hands swift but faltering, and reached for one marked vial. Guards in the loading bay were alert from the start. One shouted, "Stop her!" 2 guards lunged. A short, violent exchange followed. A tray overturned, glass shattered, a metal crate fell and dented. The technician fought. She pushed a guard and tried to pull the crate back toward the alcove. The confrontation escalated quickly. Juta Ishi arrived at the loading bay, his coat brushing against cold steel. He to the guard captain, "Secure her." "Document resistance," the guard captain barked. "She's under arrest." The guards held the sympathetic technician by the arms. She strained and spat. "You don't know what you've done!" The survivors in the holding cells pressed themselves against their bars and watched the crack that had appeared in staff obedience be stomped flat. A rapid exchange of lines took place between Ishi and the guard captain. "Document her motives," Ishi instructed. "If she confesses, note her words." The guard captain replied. "Yes, Dr. Ishi." "Then remove her to isolation and record time of removal." Ishi also catalogued the crate serials for transfer. The conversation was cold, procedural, and decisive. It reduced a resistance attempt into a logged event and public example. In the violent suppression that followed, the sympathetic technician received a stamped notice of punitive reclassification. Guards dragged her away. She kicked the concrete and cursed Ishi's name. Prisoners watched, and at least one muttered, "They'll kill her later." The narrator recorded the time of her removal and the serial of the broken crate. That recorded detail would later be compared with field logs. After the struggle, the anonymous survivor hid a single salvaged scrap in the hollow of his shoe. He folded it tight, jammed it between sole and instep, and felt the paper crease under pressure. That action was both small and decisive. It converted a torn list of dates into a physical object that could survive handling and transfer. It was an ember of testimony, as the narrator later recorded, though he did not use the word ember. He logged the evidence tag and the time of concealment. Night closed the compound, and the narrator entered the isolation ward to record the day's final effects. In the corridor, a guard checked each cell and noted which prisoners had been moved. The sympathetic technician's absence was marked on a whiteboard with an entry that read, "Personnel reclassified." The narrator wrote the entry number and a brief note on the technician's removal. The anonymous survivor, left in a small cell, listened to the distant hum of refrigeration and pressed his palm to the hidden scrap. Two surprising reveals altered the chapter's meaning. First, clerks found a mislabeled manifest in a supply crate, a manifest dated earlier that morning but stamped as if it had left the bay a day before. The discovery suggested deliberate manipulation of departure times. Second, a junior officer who had delivered the sealed directive was seen in conversation with a field unit liaison in private 10 minutes after the loading. The liaison slipped a small envelope into the officer's pocket. Those two discoveries changed the survivor's understanding. Experimentation was linked to planned operational deployment rather than confined study. The survivor adjusted his plans. He used the expectation of morning roll calls to create a pretext. When a guard opened his cell to check for blankets, he answered with quiet, halting speech. "Blanket is torn," the guard grunted and moved on. The survivor shifted his foot to press the scrap closer to the sole and felt the paper edge cut into his skin. The physical sting kept him awake and focused. He counted the hours until the morning watch change. Dialogue continued to reveal relationships and tensions. The guard captain drew to Ishii, "If command approves field deployment, we must maintain chain of custody." Ishii replied, "Chain, catalog, and compliance. Any deviation is liability." The guard captain, "Understood, doctor." The exchange used names and short lines to keep the record clear in the narrator's log. 3 external events occurred in quick succession the next morning. A truck arrived outside the loading bay. Clerks brought forward sealed crates. A field liaison inspected serials and stamped the manifest. Then an unanticipated visitor, a uniformed officer from a regional command, entered Ishii's office and asked a question about specimen selection that Ishii had not been prepared to answer. The newcomer opened a file and read aloud a line that referenced a population segment not previously included in the program's notes. The room shifted. The program's scope had quietly expanded again. Ishii answered the newcomer with a composed set of sentences. "Select high, yield subjects. Prioritize mobility, tested specimens. Document maneuver insertion." The newcomer looked up and said, "This is not research. This is deployment priority." Ishii's response was precise. "Then execute under medical authority." The newcomer paused, then left with a curt nod. The exchange made clear that military priorities now guided experimental choices. At midday, the survivor watched a crate labeled with the same military seal loaded onto a truck. He noticed one crate bore a dent matching the broken crate from the night's suppression. That physical continuity gave a tangible thread to the stolen evidence. The narrator recorded the crate serials and noted the dent location. The survivor's fear shifted again, this time toward a grim clarity. If the crates left the compound, the evidence would be dispersed into field units and disappear. The chapter reaches a cliffhanger when a clerk carrying a dossier nearly collides with the survivor's cell door and drops a paper that flutters toward the bars. The paper bears a stamp and a name that implies an intended recipient outside the compound. The survivor lunged and snatched the paper as a guard approached. The guard's shadow fell over the bars, and the survivor had to decide whether to show the guard or tuck it away. He chose to hide it inside his shoe next to the scrap. That concealment binds the two pieces of evidence together physically and narratively. Near the end of the day, Ishi called the guard captain into his office and said, "Catalogue the incident with the technician as necessary. List her as insubordinate and schedule a reclassification hearing." The guard captain replied, "Yes, doctor." His voice was flat. The sympathetic technician remained removed, and the guards had demonstrated how the program would treat any obstruction. The chapter closes with concrete action rather than reflection. The survivor, during the final roll call, felt the truck's engine rumble away in the distance. He pressed his palm to the sole of his shoe, feeling two folded scraps against the skin, and slid his fingers along the seam to confirm they had not shifted. A loading bay shutter slammed shut across the compound. In the isolation corridor, a guard made a notation on the door. Specimen transfer logged. The narrator recorded the time and the crate's serial numbers that matched the dented box. The last line ties directly to the next chapter's problem. Outside, a truck bore at least one crate missing clear chain of custody documentation. Inside, the survivor held the only physical trace that linked the cold experiments to field deployment. The survivor's decision to hide the scraps is a concrete choice that moves the plot forward and sets the stakes for the coming reckoning. The chapter ends as the loading bay light clicks off, and the survivor's breath fogs once against the cold, a discrete action that marks the moment before the next escalation. A transport crate tore open in the service corridor and a stretcher slid out, soaked at one end and crusted with knife marks. Suspicion snapped through the two men who found it. One shouted for a guard while the other shoved a flashlight inside and found frost along a stitched limb. The crate carried a stamped identification tag that should never have left the lab. The immediate problem was simple and intolerable. Experiments meant to stay sealed had appeared in circulation, and someone had moved them. The narrator recorded the scene with the same detached cadence used for inventory reports, but the word, suspicion, moved through the staff room like a tally on a ledger. The narrator noted the crate number, the tag number, and an absence where the ledger should have matched the shipment. Lab technician Kuroda wiped his palms on his coveralls and said, "This wasn't logged." Senior guard Nakamura answered with a clipped breath, "Secure the corridor." Their voices were short. The corridor smelled of concrete dust and old oil. The stretcher smelled of metal and disinfectant. Kuroda crouched and pulled the stretcher free. The thawed limb lay half, covered by a canvas flap. He touched the cloth with the heel of his gloved hand and flinched at the roughness of fresh sutures. He found a torn page jammed under the crate lining and lifted it free. He read the heading aloud, unsteady. Aerosol trial, entry coded Kuroda. "This is not a transport mistake." Nakamura barked a route order. The corridor filled with men moving on instruction, not curiosity. Judra. Shiro Ishii arrived in a uniform that still bore lab flourishes, a faded khaki jacket over a white coat. Thin spectacles settled on his nose. He examined the crate without touching it, his hands tucked into the pockets of the jacket. Ishii's voice was even. "Log it as a mislabeling error," he said. He turned the stretcher slightly and checked the tag. He spoke the entry number aloud. The narrator recorded the mismatch between his authorized entries and the torn ledger. Ishii's presence changed the tone from discovery to command. Kuroda kept the torn page in his hand. "This says Aerosol Series C." Ishii did not answer at once. He lifted his chin, then ordered the corridor sealed. Nakamura called for 2 extra locks and a closed manifest. A technician who had watched the stretcher convulse in the cold earlier ran his thumb along a faded hospital stamp and whispered, "We moved cases last night." The narrator catalogued the move as a factual anomaly. Crates moved, records sanitized. Anonymous survivor lay curled inside a pallet bag that had been stacked with cadaver covers. He moaned when a flashlight hit his face. Guards hauled the pallet toward a quarantine bay that smelled of bleach. The survivor pushed a trembling hand through the canvas and said, "Record me. Say my number." He tried to force the words into order. Senior guard Nakamura shoved the opener shut and said, "This is not for you." The guard's fingers tightened on the canvas, while Kuroda held the torn ledger against his chest. The survivor's plea created a choice with immediate consequences. If the team recorded his statement, the ledger could be corroborated. If they isolated him and burned the paper, the trail closed. Ishii moved like a surgeon deciding incision points. Demonstration will show control. Log everything as a quarantine transfer. His tone carried the authority of a man who had written procedure manuals. Kuroda saw the ledger in the doctor's hand and understood the refrain. The leak could be turned into proof of containment. Tension tightened into argument. "Kuroda, if we burn this, towns will disappear from the list." Ishii replied, "You will not risk panic." Secure and incinerate. Kuroda pushed the torn page into his pocket anyway and met Ishii's eyes. Nakamura order. Public quarantine, private purge. 4 technicians moved to the furnace room. The narrator noted these commands without moral commentary, cataloging them as steps taken. At the temporary quarantine bay, the staff set up an improvised demonstration slab. The survivor's wrists were bound to cold metal bars. He tried to speak, but his voice came ragged and small. Ishii prepared a syringe and placed a gloved thumb on the green cap. He spoke quietly to the assembled staff. "This will show the vector operates under controlled exposure," he said. He spoke as if discussing yield curves. The technician who had slipped the ledger page into his pocket swallowed and kept his hands folded. Anonymous survivor pleaded, "Record my name. Record the towns." His mouth worked. They detest us, and then forget." A guard cut across him, quiet. "This is containment demonstration." Ishii tapped the syringe against his palm and said, "Nakamura, hold him." The guard moved without hesitation. The survivor's eyes searched faces and landed on Kuroda. He whispered, "Kuroda, please." Kuroda's fingers shook around the ledger in his pocket. The demonstration began. Ishii inserted the syringe in a measured motion. The subject convulsed as the agent took hold. Staff reacted with a mix of clinical note, taking and visible recoil. Nakamura spoke once, low, "Enough." Ishii watched the monitor attached to the slab and said, "Observe the incubation response." He read numbers aloud. The survivor's chest heaved, his pupils dilated. A technician stepped back and knocked over a tray. Glass shattered. The narrator wrote time stamps and physiological responses as if cataloging a machine failure. The scene forced 2 kinds of movement in people: practical procedure and moral calculation. Kuroda kept his hand over the ledger in his pocket. He had to decide whether to act on the survivor's plea or follow Ishii's order to burn the record. He felt suspicion shift to anger. He walked to the furnace room, then stopped and turned back when he heard a technician cry out. He returned and asked Ishii, "What happens if someone outside finds this paper?" Ishii answered, "Then we remove the vector and blame contamination." "Kuroda, you will burn towns with that phrase." Ishii's jaw tightened. He said, "I am protecting method and mission." The exchange lasted 2 breaths and then moved into commands again. A torn lab ledger surfaced under the crate lining, its pages wet at the edges. Kuroda smoothed one fragment against his palm and read aloud. Aerosol dispersion. Small settlements prioritized. The technician who had handled frost chambers earlier, Satu, whispered, "We did frost trials last month. We logged cold protocol only." Sato's voice had the thin rasp of someone who had handled victims of exposure. Ishii closed his mouth and said nothing for a long count. The narrator recorded the contradiction between public entries and private pages. Outside the quarantine bay, the furnace door opened and technicians fed ledger scraps into the blaze. A guard stamped a manifest and sealed a crate. Faces went blank with the discipline of trained men performing damage control. One technician, Ito, wiped his hand on his pants and refused to stir the wet smear of ink that named a small town. He stood and looked at Kuroda. Ito's index finger trembled. He said, "I want I burn the smear," Kuroda answered. "Take it and hide it." Ito nodded and slid the scrap into his pocket. The action was small, but it shifted the probabilities. Something might survive the purge. The demonstration's immediate outcome was intended as deterrent. Ishii ordered the survivor kept alive until transport protocols could be staged. Nakamura recorded a sealed quarantine and wrote transport manifest numbers that matched Ishii's directions. Kuroda, Ito, and Sato watched while the furnace took pages and smoke curled along the ceiling. Emotion shifted again in the group. Anger cooled into a brittle resignation among most, fear rising in others who considered consequences beyond the lab. Kuroda found himself answering the survivor with a short, raw sentence. "I'll try to save the page." The survivor clasped his hands and closed his eyes. In the stairwell before dawn, Ito slid the hidden scrap toward Kuroda. The scrap listed 2 names and a town that had not appeared in the official logs. Kuroda kept it folded in the palm of his hand. He felt an odd clarity. He could obey Ishii's public order or preserve evidence that could one day expose deliberate dissemination. The decision required action by technicians, not by leaders. The staff had become the hinge. Ishii staged a public statement. A sealed quarantine, a controlled demonstration to calm rumor. He spoke into a recorder methodically, giving times and inventory numbers. "We observed a containment breach, handled under quarantine protocol," he said. He did not say how a crate left the archive. Outside, supply trucks rolled at scheduled hours. Inside, the narrator continued to record actions and contradictions without editorial comment. The record itself became contested ground. A fast argument erupted when a junior guard discovered a mislabeled transport manifest. Guard Sakamoto raised his voice. "Sakamoto. This tray is stamped for 3 towns, the ledger doesn't T-list." Ishii intervened with clipped orders. "Sakamoto, correct the stamp." Nakamura reassigned the manifest. The argument lasted several fast exchanges. Sakamoto repeated the stamp numbers. Nakamura insisted on procedure. Ishii replaced the discrepancy with a sanitized number. The rapid back and forth made it clear who held power and who risked consequence when they protested. The survivor's body remained the most obvious evidence. He recovered enough to speak in short bursts. "They put needles in my arm," he said to Kuroda. "They called it Trial C." Kuroda wrote down the phrase and set the ledger's hidden scrap beside it. Tell me the names again." The survivor said the town name and the times of transport. He named a technician who had been absent during a scheduled move. Kuroda realized the technician's absence might explain the crate's misrouting. The chapter reached a secondary turning point when a technician found a ruptured vial tucked behind a shelf in the storage wing. Sato picked it up with gloved hands and called out. The vial contained a fine powder that dissolved into a faint mist the moment it contacted air. Sato coughed and hit his chest. "This shouldn't be here," he said. Ishii leaned close, eyes narrow. "Label it contamination and place under sealed protocol," he ordered. Sato hesitated, then moved to lock the shelf. The discovery hardened the suspicion that experiments were leaving controlled spaces intentionally. Ishii's private order came next. He summoned Nakamura to his anteroom and spoke without the recorder. "Remove witnesses. Burn anything that points beyond our walls. Demonstrate control and move the risk out of range." Nakamura's face did not change. "Yes, doctor," he said. The words were short. The narrator listed the command and its execution steps: quiet removal, staged demonstration, incineration. The climax unfolded in the quarantine bay when Ishii staged the live demonstration as a lesson. Guards pinned the survivor to the slab while Ishii administered an injection and narrated observable effects like a technician describing a failing machine. The survivor's contractions were violent enough that a technician cursed and shifted away. Nakamura barked, "Hold him." Kuroda stepped forward with a ledger in his pocket and said, "This belongs in evidence." Ishii turned his head and answered, "You will not make evidence of procedures public." Several staff members exchanged short, furious lines. Rapid dialogue overlapped then. "Kuroda, Ishii, the ledger says they spread it outside. Ishii, you are creating chaos. Kuroda, Ito, we can smuggle the page out. Nakamura, no one will walk out with paper." Sato shouted, "Stop doing this!" The exchange lasted 6 lines in quick succession. The survivor gasped. Hands tightened on straps. A tray clattered against metal. The room smelled of disinfectant and heated metal. The live demonstration ended with the subject unconscious and breathing shallowly. Ishii stepped back, eyes cool. He instructed the guards to catalogue the subject as a quarantine case and to prepare transport. He ordered the ledger fragments from the furnace to be rechecked and any remaining pages to be destroyed. In the furnace room, Ito pressed the hidden scrap to his chest and folded it behind a false lining in his jacket. The narrator recorded the incineration timings and the names assigned to the transport manifest. After the demonstration, faces changed. Technicians resumed mechanical tasks with an added weight. Kuroda met Ito in the corridor and nodded once. Ito showed the hidden scrap with his thumb and kept his voice low. "I slipped this out," he said. Kuroda folded the scrap into his palm. "We will keep it safe until someone outside can verify it," he answered. The narrator ended the chapter by noting that secrecy had been reasserted outwardly, while a small act of concealment had soon a different path inwardly toward exposure. The final scene took place in the dim stairwell before dawn. Kuroda tucked the folded scrap inside the lining of his coat and sealed the seam with a thread from his machine. He heard a knock at the outer hatch, a delivery truck arriving on schedule. He slipped the ledger scrap into his pocket and walked toward the furnace smoke that still rose along the service wing. As he passed the quarantine bay door, the survivor's breath rasped behind it. Kuroda did not stop. Nakamura slid the sealed manifest across a desk and said, "Transport leaves at 6. Kuroda folded his shoulders and moved outside. The chap's small act of concealment had created a promise. The record might yet survive the purge, and with it, a way to unmask deliberate harm. Emotion root. Suspicion led choices, shifting to anger when evidence contradicted public logs, and to fear when orders became explicit about erasure. Those shifts appear in short actions: reading a torn ledger, arguing over a furnace, hiding a scrap in a jacket. The chapter ends on a concrete beat. A knock at the outer hatch and the sealed manifest being slid across a desk. The leak had been contained outwardly, but a hidden page had survived, and someone outside the lab would now hold a choice. The immediate conflict, whether evidence would be preserved or destroyed, was resolved in the small, practical action of hiding paper, not in rhetoric. The narrator closed the file with a line item. One ledger scrap removed from incineration and stored by staff. That catalogue entry marked both a failure of official secrecy and the starting point for the next investigation. A service hatch scraped open, and technician Kato's lamp revealed an empty refrigerated crate and a thin smear of dried blood tracing toward the corridor. Suspicion tightened Kato's hands as he crouched and touched the crate's cold lip. The metal gave no answer. He called up the shaft with the lamp swinging, and the guard on duty answered with clipped steps. Within 3 sentences, the ward's central problem was clear. Sterile material had vanished, and something living might carry its contagion. Kato rose and walked the service tunnel with the lamp held low. The narrator recorded the scene without flourish. Missing cultures, an open seal, a trail of dark residue. Kato prodded the smear with a gloved fingertip and frowned. "Kato," the senior guard said, not a question. "There are no crates recorded as released." "Kato." "It wasn't here when I checked at 2:05. The guard's voice tightened. He tapped his radio. The stakes were immediate. Contamination, lost specimens, and a potential living vector moving through service corridors. The narrator placed those facts next to the earlier entry about the operating slab and the lack of anesthesia from Chapter 1. The record from that night remained. A bound man slammed onto metal, an entry number logged, no anesthesia noted. Ishii's presence had been recorded then, overseeing procedure. Kato's discovery now echoed that earlier brutality and raised the question of procedural failure turning into active danger. Kato moved faster. The lamp's cone cut through steam and spilled flecks of dust. He shouted down the corridor and found a transport team at a transfer bay wheeling a stretcher. A prisoner lay strapped, skin mottled, coughing sputum that left a dark smear on the blanket. The prisoner clawed the restraints and hissed a single word that passed throat and teeth. Water. The guards tightened straps and did not answer. The narrator logged the transport's details. Time stamped, tag number obscured, temperature readings called out by a technician. The technician's voice was higher than usual. 39.2, he said. Fever. The transport officer barked. Keep him quiet. Kato, where's the crate? The officer answered, no crate. He came from supply. We found him in a service lift. The narrator noted the discrepancy between paperwork and what technicians found on the floor. Inventory, said Sealed. Inventory was wrong. Jutashiro Ishii arrived as the transfer team clattered into the anteroom. He moved with measured steps and a surgical fold to his coat. Ishii pushed a thin spectacle up his nose and inspected the prisoner without touching him. Bring the prisoner forward. Ishii, record everything. His voice smoothed urgency into control. Technician Kato met Ishii's eyes. Suspicion in Kato flickered into a new sensation when Ishii dismissed immediate quarantine orders. Containment procedure now, Kato urged, keeping his voice low. Ishii replied, not yet. Samples first, Kato. Samples can wait if this is contagious. Ishii's hand hovered over the instruments. Data must be recovered. Kato. That is the priority. The narrator wrote the exchange down as a fact. Ishii prioritized research results over immediate isolation. The lab anterooms smelled of disinfectant and oil. Instruments sat in trays, tags lay on clipboards. Kato watched Ishii sign a slim card and stamp the file. The prisoner coughed again, blood flecking the lips, and the guards exchanged looks that carried alarm. The narrator kept to the concrete. A man bleeding from the mouth, a set of hands that would not unstrap him. Suspicion shifted into alarm as technicians checked oxygen saturations and noted odd readings. His blood pressure is falling, the senior guard reported. He is losing fluid. Kato, we should move him to quarantine. Ishii, bring him to observation. Sato, prepare the slab. That order pushed the team into motion with a new aim. Immediate data collection. The prisoner in the observation slab shivered and convulsed. The narrator recorded the timing. A convulsion at 20 minutes after arrival, blood from the nose, and then an unexpected bleeding from other orifices that technicians could not explain. Technician voices rose. This pattern is abnormal. Sato, flipping pages. We haven't seen this distribution. Kato, it looks like internal damage, but not from trauma. The prisoner tore at straps and his breath came in shallow bursts. Dra. Ishii watched, a pen tracing notes in a leather notebook. His face did not soften. Kato's suspicion hardened into a different motion. Fear that procedures were insufficient. Sato moved toward a shelf, fingers finding a small vial with a faded label. I'll take a swab. Kato reached out. Wait. Seal the corridor first. Guards hesitated. Ishii, no quarantine yet. Take the swab and bring it to analysis. The corridor's door remained open. The narrator wrote the moment plainly. A decision point where containment could have been immediate and a higher order directive instead requested specimen recovery for research. The air in the lab ward changed when the prisoner convulsed again, and a viscous discharge expelled from his mouth. It sprayed the slab and pooled on the floor. The senior guard barked, "Cover him!" Sato stepped back and dropped the vial. It bounced and cracked. Sato! Kato! The prisoner spat a string of bloody froth and then began to gasp in patterns no one recognized. Technical monitors fluttered. Ishii did not move to help. He moved to the observation window and adjusted the angle of view, record everything. Ishii, this agent behaves differently than our models. The narrator noted the language and the choice. Medical curiosity framed over immediate human care. Kato's fear became anger. He grabbed the record sheet and slapped it down. "We lock this ward now," he said. Voice rough, "We quarantine the entire transfer bay." Ishii looked at Kato and then at the prisoner convulsing beneath restraints. "If you lock the ward, you destroy the chain of custody," Ishii replied. "We lose data. We lose chance." Kato's jaw tightened. His breaths were short. "We lose people if you delay containment." Kato, "We lose people if we don't act now." The guards moved between them. The narrator wrote the clash as it unfolded, a moral fracture that was quickly shifting the lab's equilibrium. Sato stepped forward and spoke with a voice that carried both measure and strain. "Dra, Ishii, Sato, the notes I found." He tapped his jacket pocket and hesitated. "They indicate an anomalous growth pattern. We should not proceed without proper containment protocol." Ishii's mouth tightened. "Sato, Ishii, you are junior. Do as instructed." Sato steadied. "No. I cannot authorize vivisection without quarantine steps." Senior guard barked. "Sato, step away." "Kato, Sato, what did you find?" Sato unclipped a folded page and passed it across. The notes pictured lesions and included a margin scribble noting cross, contamination risk. Kato read aloud, "Marginal cross, infectivity noted. Avoid open air." The guards stiffened as if struck. Ishii's face drained, but he kept his voice even. "We study now or we study never," he said. The argument tightened into a short, sharp exchange. "Ishii, Sato, this is containment protocol violation." Ishii answered, "Your violation is cowardice." Senior guard, "Enough." The narrator recorded the tension as a sequence of commands and refusals. An order to proceed, a refusal to comply, and guards who could escalate into force. The lab became a battlefield of small, decisive acts. A hand reaching for a syringe, a foot planted to hold a door, a folded page hidden against a chest. The forced procedure began. Ishii authorized a vivisection under restraint to retrieve samples directly. Guards pinioned the prisoner. Sato refused to assist and stepped back. "Sato, get in there." Ishii ordered. "Sato, move." Sato kept his hands at his sides. "I refuse," he said. "I will not aid this without quarantine." Senior guard moved closer and said, "Sato, last chance." The guard's voice carried a manual threat. Kato shouted, "Stop." The prisoner convulsed and jerked with violent force. A strap tore. In the operating slab, the prisoner managed to tear a restraint and flail. Flesh scraped metal with a metallic scream. The narrator recorded the instant. The prisoner ripped free enough to roll and strike a tray. A cloud of viscous discharge sprayed over the floor and onto the faces of technicians who had not expected exposure. The discharge hissed where it hit hot metal. One technician staggered and clutched his throat. Sato lunged to cover his face with his sleeve and, in that motion, slipped a small vial from his coat and folded it into his hand. He did not speak. The narrator noted the motion and its meaning, an act of preservation concealed inside chaos. Chaos became containment failure. The ward alarms shrieked. Quarantine teams banged doors and sealed corridors, but not before technicians and guards collapsed with the same strange symptoms the prisoner showed. Ishii issued orders in short sentences now. "Colder, seal wing B, decontaminate staff C through G. Burn contaminated bedding." He chose data over evacuation, and the narrator logged each command as evidence of priorities. Kato moved to help the injured and kept glancing at Sato. "Kato, Sato, what did you take?" Sato, "Nothing." He folded his hands in his coat and a vial rested against his palm. Sato found a records alcove and hid the anomalous clinical notes and the small vial in a narrow compartment behind a stack of wrapped instruments. His hands shook. He to Kato in a low voice, "I can let Ishii destroy all proof. Kato, then prove it. Get it out." The night nurse moved through the ward, eyes wide, and Sato handed her a stained scrap of paper folded into a cigarette pack. "Night nurse," Sato whispered. "Carry this out when you can." The nurse's fingers closed on the note. "Sato, you will be searched," she said. "Take the vial now." Sato slipped the vial into his inner pocket and buttoned the coat. The narrator observed the scene with distinct attention to gestures. Hands that hide, a pocket that closes, a nurse who accepts risk. Down the corridor, quarantine teams tallied bodies and marked doors with large, blunt stamps. The narrator recorded the tolling as a bureaucratic ritual. Bodies stacked, corridors sealed, the mechanical click of doors locking. The lab's official log would later list causes in sterile language. The narrator did not editorialize. Every entry was a concrete action. Tally sheets filled, bodies sealed in canvases, keys turned in locks. Sato slipped past a supply door and moved into the dim service tunnel. He kept his coat tight and walked with a folded gait designed to look like exhaustion. A mid-chapter cliffhanger arrived when a transport crate in the corridor opened to reveal Frost along a stitched limb and a stitched identification tag half-tier. A passing technician found it and called out. Kato ran and found the crate with a torn symbol and a single, smeared fingerprint inside. He pressed his gloved fingers to the tag and then looked up. That discovery reframed earlier assumptions. The missing crate had contained more than glass vials. It had carried living tissue, and possibly carriers moved through service channels. The revelation triggered a small, sharp confrontation between Kaito and the senior guard. How did this leave the freezer? Kato demanded. Senior guard chain of custody shows sealed. Kato, someone opened it here. Senior guard's tone hardened. Someone carried something with authorization. Kato, find who? The senior guard barked orders and men moved to run records checks. The narrator recorded the administrative shift, a hunt through logs, a search for fingerprints, and technicians checking transfer manifests. Ishii convened a narrow meeting in his office with the senior guard and 2 technicians. Sato had been removed from the central area by order of an officious sergeant to be questioned. Ishii sat and tapped his pen on the notebook's leather. Containment is a priority, Ishii. He phrased it as a fact rather than a choice. The senior guard answered, You delayed quarantine, Ishii. We recovered data that will explain the agent. We cannot discard 30 years of work for panic. Kato spoke from the doorway. Will that data save them? Will it save the men bleeding on the slabs? Ishii did not answer directly. He only wrote a new instruction on the note and sealed it with a stamp. The narrator followed Sato as he moved through the early morning light toward a supply exit. He felt the weight of the vial in his pocket as a physical thing. Suspicion that had become fear used his shoulders as leverage. He kept his head down and walked with the gait of someone carrying contraband. The night nurse watched him go, holding the scrap of paper between 2 fingers. She had a clinic badge and the pallor of someone who had seen too many wounds. She to herself, I will not be the one to let this die. Her voice was a small human action that altered the ward's arc. The aftermath was a ledger of choices. Quarantine teams sealed off entire wings, and the narrator recorded the time and the number of sealed doors. Ishii authorized a summary report framed to keep the program intact. Sato vanished into the early light with a small vial hidden beneath his heart. Kato stayed behind and helped staff clean the wards, his hands raw from scrubbing. The narrator noted details. Kato's palms, the pattern of bruises on the injured technician, the folds in Sato's coat where the vial rested. The chapter ended on a concrete beat. Sato handed the vial to the night nurse in the dim corridor outside the sealed laboratory and whispered, Take this to the contact east of the gate. Do not open it here. The nurse folded the vial into her knitted scarf and stepped away. A security patrol passed and did not search them closely. The narrator logged the action. Evidence concealed, proof moving out of the compound, and the lab's official line preparing to write the event as controlled. The final recorded detail was procedural. A stamped log entry listing a containment breach, and a notation that samples were lost in transit. The last sentence in the chapter left the reader with a precise image, a nurse walking into the dawn with a small glass vial pressed against her chest. And no rhetorical flourish, only the weight of an action that might carry truth beyond the walls. The radio in the command bunker crackled a single line that made every head turn. Inspectors would reach the compound at first light. Suspicion tightened Kato's jaw as Dra. Shiro Ishii came up from the map table and slammed his palm down. "Move now," Ishii ordered, voice flat and precise. Men straightened, boxes were counted and resealed. The central problem stood exposed within 5 breaths. If the inspectors saw the logs and vials, the program, its personnel, and the chain of decisions would be visible. Suspicion drove choices that night. It pushed otherwise cautious hands toward irreversible acts. Kato was not the only man whose actions changed on that sound. Lieutenant Sato barked instructions down the corridor, and the guards turned a maintenance route into an execution of procedure. The narrator recorded times. Midnight, 12:30, 107. The building smelled of machine oil and boiled metal. The cold had leached into the pipes. Everything that had been tucked into place for years now risked unfastening with a single inspection. The immediate conflict arrived as a command and a simple deadline: remove evidence, relocate anything marked with the unit's insignia, and dispose of bodies and instruments that could identify the source. They moved fast. Ishii delegated with thin-edged clarity logs. "Crate 5, incinerator access now," he said. His gestures were small, efficient. "Assistant Dur." Morita answered with a curt nod and left the bunker with a stack of folders. Kato lingered in the doorway, listening to the radio's hiss. He had been the technician who found the copied registry volumes earlier. Suspicion had led him to the vault weeks before. That suspicion had turned to curiosity, then to risk, and now to active concealment. Kato felt the tilt of his options. Follow orders and burn what remained, or use the copies he'd hidden to put pieces of truth beyond the compound's reach. A guard shoved a hooded prisoner across the service corridor toward the incinerator access door. The survivor's shoulders bowed under the hood. His hands were cuffed, wrists padded with old bandage. The narrator noted the name printed on the stamped identification tag, the chipped paint on the gurney wheels, the scrape along the metal door frame where crates had slid for years. The survivor's breathing sounded quick in the corridor's concrete throat. Those details mattered. They would anchor testimony later. This was a time-pressured operation, and hurriedness sharpened small mistakes. Kato found Morita leaning against a crate near the records vault entrance. They spoke in low, clipped sentences. "You copied the logs." "Kato, yes." "Morita, enough to prove some things." She handed him a sealed bundle. "Take it. Make a route." Kato's fingers closed over the packet. He felt the weight of paper and the risk of steps yet to take. Morita's voice went lower. "If they see these, they burn everything and name individuals. If they don't, they will still bury the rest." A tension rose when Ishii returned and caught sight of them. He moved across the corridor with a pace that brooked no delay. "Morita," he said, "procedure is simple. No delays. Anyone who holds records is a liability." His eyes landed on Kato. "Technician Kato, can you secure the registries?" The line cut the air. Kato answered with a nod that carried more than assent. He understood that refusal meant immediate suspicion. The first external event after the bunker order. A crate marked with a transport stamp tore open in the service corridor as 2 guards heaved it into the incineration chute. Material slumped out, and a stretcher slid free with a smear of dried blood along its edge. A guard swore and shone a flashlight into the crate, finding frost along a stitched limb. They reported up the line. The narrator recorded the crate number and the patchwork stitching on the canvas. Those concrete details would matter for later investigators. Back in the records vault, Kato and Morita argued in whispers that edged toward a clash. "You cannot put that on a courier without a plan." "Kato, plan or no plan?" "Kato, it must go." Morita replied, "I want my name gone. I want the pocket copies out." "Who will take it?" he asked. "Someone leaving with a food convoy." "Someone they want to search closely." The argument tightened into quick exchanges of fact and choice. 3 rapid lines followed. "You will get caught. Then be careful. You sound like Ishii." Morita's laugh was hollow. "Then do better than I did. Hide it on a body if you must." Hide it where they will not look if they plan to cremate the camp. Kato offload it now. Kato moved with the bundle concealed beneath his jacket. He checked the hallway cameras, only to find a maintenance panel disabled and 2 screws missing. That broken panel was a small victory born of months of petty sabotage. His heart rate rose. He swallowed a sound. The next external event arrived. Lieutenant Sato arrived at the vault with 2 guards and a clipboard that listed the crates to be moved and the bodies to be forwarded to the decontamination bay. He read the list aloud, voice flat. Crate 2, 4, 8, patient 9 to decontamination. Move. The timing fit Ishii's purge plan. In the decontamination chamber, the hooded survivor was strapped to a gurney. Morita had slipped the bundle into the collar of his thin coat, while technicians prepped the bay. The survivor's hands trembled when he touched the packet. He mouthed a sound to Morita. She only held her face steady and whispered, "Carry this if you can." Her pupils pinched as if choosing between 2 outcomes. The survivor's role shifted instantly from passive cargo to a potential courier. He had been a human subject days before. Now he carried pages that could rewrite responsibility. This was a twist. A person slated for disposal became a living archive. The narrator recorded the movement. Morita's fingers quick under fabric, the feel of paper sliding warm against skin, the pressure of Sato's grip on the gurney's handle. No metaphors, only the body's actions and their effects. The next external event was simple and catastrophic. During the transfer in the decontamination bay, a vial shattered. The sound was a sharp, chemical crack. The decontamination venting started, and a fog rolled low over the tiled floor where they had wheeled the gurney. Someone shouted orderless words. Alarms kicked in with a mechanical keening. Technicians moved to seal the nearest hatches. Ishii snapped commands, but the fog spread faster than confinement efforts. The fog smelled metallic and peppery. Men cuffed. Guards fired into the space to force control. Flashes lit the ciphered labels on jars as men ducked. A guard screamed a single name and then was silent. The narrator recorded the noises and the exact sequence. A vial hit tile, a small cloud uncoiled, lights flickered, and the alarms kept time. That breach was the chapter's climax. Morita stepped forward in front of an open maintenance shaft where Kato had earlier hidden thin copies of registry pages. She pushed a metal trolley against the door and then shoved it partway into the maintenance shaft, then used her body to keep it there. Her hands bled from a cut she had received earlier. She made no show of pain. Ishii attempted to seal exits, shouting at Sato to hold doors and at technicians to close dampers. Kato grabbed at Morita's sleeve. "Get the survivor out," he said, voice raw. "Get the pages out." "No," Morita simply. Her fingers found the packet at the survivor's collar and forced it into Kato's hands in a motion that left the paper folded in his palm. "Kato, run." Ishii's voice came from the other side of the bay. "Who is disrupting the purge? Who is endangering containment?" 3 guards answered in a flurry, and one demanded, "Stand down!" The back and forth turned brutal and blurred into a wash of shouted names and commands. Kato shoved the bundle into his inner coat and moved toward the service hatch, while Morita took a step that drove her forward, between a guard and the survivor. A guard grabbed Morita's arm. She did not release. She pushed a metal tray under the guard's boot, and the guard stumbled. The gas thickened. Kato coughed, lungs constricted, vision narrowing at the corners. He found the hatch and pushed upward. The survivor slid through the opening on hands and knees, dragging his cuffs. Kato forced himself to follow. He felt a sharp tug at his collar as someone reached through the hatch and tried to hold him back. He yanked his coat free. The hatch closed with a clang. In the duct's narrow dark, he heard the sound of a single rifle shot, and the small wet sound of a body hitting metal some distance away. Outside the bay, men opened fire into the haze to keep control. An explosive crack answered an alarm. A technician shoved a smoking tool into a vent and then coughed and keeled over as his lungs rebelled. Kato twisted through service passages that smelled of burnt rubber and boiled insulation. He felt the packet curve against his spine like a second heartbeat. He kept thinking of Morita's face, how steady she seemed when she handed him the bundle, how the line between her expression and the commander's had narrowed to a single set of choices. The mid-chapter cliffhanger arrived in the ventilation duct. A maintenance door scraped open ahead, and a flashlight beam swung across Kato's path. He froze on the ladder. Footsteps paused above and then retreated. The beam narrowed and then moved away. Kato exhaled and slid forward another meter, letting the concrete ring with his breath. The reader could, and the later interrogators did, wonder if the beam had been the inspectors already inside or a guard searching for an escape. In the duct, that moment of halted motion split the immediate probability into two: capture or passage. Kato found the service passages that led to the ruined courtyard. He saw staff collapsing in corners, faces waxen with exposure. Some men carried scorched equipment to the incinerator and threw documents in handfuls into the fire. Others dragged bodies. Kato saw a guard he recognized from the bunker slump to his knees and vomit into a drain. Those sights moved Kato through a shift of emotion, from suspicion to urgency to a cold responsibility toward the packet in his coat. He had begun the night wanting to preserve a record. Now he had to deliver it. At dawn, investigators arrived at the main entrance. They stepped under a frame of scorched metal and into a courtyard littered with bent instruments and half-burned files. The narrator described in clinical terms the scorch patterns on an autoclave, the ink smudges on a half-charred logbook, and the number stamped on a crate that still held its label. Inspecting officers began to catalogue broken glass, and one called out a serial number that matched registry copies. Kato watched from the shadow of a collapsed service awning. He had to choose: hand the packet to a courier waiting beyond the compound or attempt to walk beyond the gate himself. Kato slipped through a maintenance gate with a courier who had been instructed to leave with a food convoy. He had arranged this earlier in whispered exchanges with a driver named Tanaka, a peripheral name now pressed into service. Tanaka appeared in the scene twice more in the next hour as he argued with a checkpoint guard over manifest lists. Their rapid back and forth included exactly 4 lines of debate. Show manifest, this is food convoy, supplies only. Search the convoy, you will delay the inspectors. Tanaka's blunt cadence fit the role. A man used to crossing checkpoints, now stepping into an argument that could cost him time or make him part of a larger truth. Kato pushed a folded packet into the inner seam of Tanaka's cloak. Tanaka's hand found it and palmed it without examining. Keep it warm, Kato. Tanaka gave a short, humorless laugh and moved toward the gate. Inside the compound, Ishii's fate grew ambiguous. The narrator recorded his movements, sealing doors, giving curt orders, pointing at names on a roster, and then retreating to the command bunker where he sat at the map table and removed his spectacles. He did not appear in custody during the initial investigation. Kato saw Ishii standing by a doorway as he slipped from the compound and could not tell if Ishii planned to flee or to fight. The narrator kept to observed facts. Ishii pressed his hand to the map table, left a coffee ring, and walked past the technicians without further speech. The inspectors found a ruined scene. They called for lists, took photographs, and marked samples for later laboratory analysis. They interviewed those who could speak. Kato kept his head low in the food convoy as the inspectors recorded names and stamped forms. He watched an officer pick up a burnt sheet of paper from the courtyard and flip it under a lamp. The officer's gloved fingers exposed a partial ledger entry, a date paired with an experiment code. That single exposed line would later link field notes to certain individuals. Kato slipped a hidden packet into a courier's coat at the convoy staging area, handing over the responsibility as if passing an odorless object. Nothing more, nothing less. He managed this while moving among men shouting for transport rotations, while a woman in a coat argued with an investigator about her brother, and while the survivor, now free of his hood and leaning on a cot, cuffed and spat thick mucus into an enamel bowl. Those scenes kept piling as external events. An uncovering of a ledger page, a guard confessing a name under questioning, an inspector ordering the cataloging of biological samples. The aftermath settled into a brittle quiet. The survivor who had crawled through the hatch came out of his hiding beneath a stack of burned crates once the courtyard emptied. His movements were slow, fingers stained with old disinfectant and ash. He unfolded the collar where Morita had tucked the pages and found the packet gone. Cato had trusted him with the transfer route. The survivor's shoulders dropped and then rose again. He walked to the convoy and touched Tanaka's sleeve. "The papers," he said in a voice that vibrated thinly. Tanaka handed the folded bundle back with a nod. "Keep it. Carry it where they want search." The survivor wrapped the packet in an oilcloth and slid it inside his tattered jacket. He had been a victim of experiments days prior. Now he carried the evidence. That was the chapter's final movement from subject to witness to actor. In the days after, investigators traced burnt registrar sheets, interviewed Kaito and others, and found discrepancies in official rosters. They recovered a copy of a registry volume Kaito had hidden in a duct, though it was water, stained, and the ink had run on several pages. Morita's whereabouts remained uncertain. Witnesses placed her near the decontamination bay, making a stand. Kaito reported her name in his testimony with the same factual restraint he had used under duress. The narrator recorded the statements, times, names, and locations, not verdicts. The chapter concluded with small, concrete resolutions. Copies of registry pages reached a courier beyond the compound and were later handed to an investigator in a neighboring town. A burned ledger supplied a clue that forced a partial inquiry. The survivor lived long enough to give a description of a technician's handwriting and of temperature readouts shouted in an old ward. Cato entered a formal interview and provided the packet of duplicated pages he had kept as a backup. His testimony and the copied notes altered how the inquiry matched names to actions. The camp did not vanish from history because documents contained in a courier's coat survived the purge. At the makeshift holding area outside the compound, the narrator recorded a final visual. The survivor sitting on a wooden crate, sleeves rolled, bandages at his wrists, eyes hollow but focused. He handed a folded sheet to the investigator and said, "This names them." The investigator read the sheet aloud, pronouncing at least 3 names that would later appear in printed accounts. The survivor's action resolved the immediate thread. Evidence had escaped. The chapter ended with a specific beat. A courier walked away with a sealed envelope under his arm, and an inspector closed a notebook and wrote a time and date. That closing scene was a fact to be recorded, not an emotion to be summarized. Across the chapter, the leading emotions moved visibly. Initial suspicion in Kato and Morita, escalating urgency under Iji's orders, fear and coughing and disorientation during the fog. Then a colder resolve that forced choices under fire. Those shifts appeared in hands that hesitated then acted, in voices that shortened from commands to small, pressed words, and in bodies that either collapsed or kept moving. Suspicion began the arc and led to decisions. Urgency converted plans into frantic movement. Fear pushed a technician to shove a packet into the hands of a courier. Resolve made a doctor hold her ground despite the cost. The final concrete image remained. A courier moving through dawn with pages hidden against his chest, and a survivor who had crawled through a service hatch and would later name specific men in a report. That sequence closed the chapter's immediate conflict. Records survived, some names were exposed, and the facility's attempt to sterilize its past failed to erase everything. The narrator closed the file on the night with times, names, and a single annotation. Copies preserved, chain of custody partial, but present. The last line of the chapter was an action, not reflection. The investigator stamped a packet received, set it in an evidence box, and locked the lid.